If you want a simple definition, the self is that which we identify with in contrast to the rest of the world. It's pretty straightforward, right at you. You can think of the self as an organizing process that takes its content from all aspects of life. But again, this notion of identification in the self system is very important, particularly in relation to cognition. You can't identify with something that you don't know exists. So to some extent, cognition has to lead the way, make the clearing, and then the person can or cannot identify with it. Something else we'll mention a little later are what in multiple intelligences Gardner might talk about as gifts or talents, and those are things which may or may not develop, and if they do, then the self usually identifies with them. But they may not develop, and that's just the way it goes. Miss Willow.
Okay. So here are the parts of the self system. The proximate self, that is what I speak of as I, or as me. So it's the way that I identify. It's the one, it's the awareness that I'm swimming in all the time, and I understand it as who I am, basically. Then there's the distal self. And the distal self is what hopefully most of you were touching in with when we did our exercise. The wounded part of ourselves that we accept as mine. It's no longer me. So I wouldn't identify at this time in my life as someone with major depression. That would be an I statement of proximate self. But I understand that it's a territory that is mine. I know what it's like to journey through a major depressive episode. And to the degree that I make it an object of awareness and embrace it as my own, not because I'm fused with it, but because it's part of the larger, now expanded me, then it's my distal self. Yeah, and your name again? Steve. As we learn everybody's name, thank you for saying that.
Earlier, Elliot, you said, you made a comment that you like to think quantitatively, right?
I lean toward that in research, and there's a lot of reasons for that.
So is that's not something that he used to be. That's not like his history in the past of being that way. That may be something that is a mode that he has a tendency toward now. Is that proximate self, or is that distal self? I mean, he can reflect on it and say it and keep it in mind. So
it's just his type, but no, I'm kidding.
I mean, where does type fit in? Would type be proximate, or would it be distal, or?
Well, I'll tell you.
Okay.
I would say at this point it's in the distal self. In graduate school in Ohio, you're able to get licensed as a psychologist and a counselor. There were huge turf wars about this, great deal of gnashing of teeth. And when I would go over to the clinical psych courses, I felt very insecure. And this is just over years of reflecting. And I decided I was going to identify with the aggressor and try to get as much power and credibility and respect as I could. And I liked the quantitative approach. I felt it had a cleanness about it, but there was also a piece that I was not aware of that was some of it was proximate and some of it was shadow at that point, as to why I feel a need to develop these skills so that it kind of enhances my image in the eyes of other people. So at that point, it was very proximate. Some of it was stuff I was not aware of. And then over the years, I realized that those things, those were there. But I do still like the quantitative approach to research, so it's more distal.
Is the proximate self necessarily unconscious? Is the proximate self always completely unconscious?
I'm going to ask Steve if I can. I want to cover that in a different slide. We'll totally get there.
Yeah,
we'll totally
good
get
question,
there.
Liz.
It is a good question. And thank you for the question about that, because it shows, I think, how we can take any aspect and what we want to do. I love your answer as a demonstration, because we don't take something and try to jam it into one of these concepts. We use the concepts to kind of help illuminate this direct experience that we're curious about.
And we'll get Sloan as a question, but just this is the thing that helps me clinically. I sit with a client and I wonder, what sorts of things jump out to me as things that would be helpful if they were made objects of awareness for this client? Because the clients, many times, they'll come in and they'll be talking about things that in many ways are increasing their suffering, but they don't really see it that way. And again, just another way to use them. Sloan?
As I heard the proximate self described, it's what I identify with, and I would respectfully disagree with that. It seems to me that that's how others pigeonhole me into learning how to relate to me. But it seems to me that the antecedent self could be what I identify with. And so I would think of the proximate self as a bit different than at least as I heard it described.
One thing that stands out for me as you raise the question is that there is this developmental question. As you begin to make things objects of awareness, we assume that this is something that facilitates movement in our altitude, facilitates our growth. And when Suzanne talks, she will talk about stages that she's called construct aware and ego aware. What happens when the very thing we would consider ego becomes an object of awareness? Does a person move toward a state where really they identify with antecedent self? And it's an excellent question. My sense of it is that there's a developmental sequence to it, but that's just my own response to the point you've raised.
And I think also what you're pointing out for us, Sloan, is that obviously these are all aspects of ourself that are constantly in relationship within this larger self. So these are ultimately, these are constructs that are the signposts in the territory. And again, we want to learn, perhaps, I would encourage us to start with a very tight and narrow definition of each of these terms to really get it. We've got the driving directions. And then, in our own field of experience, how do they actually show up? Yeah? So, continuing with sort of the tight and narrow as we go to play, the antecedent self, in the sort of basic definition, is that field of awareness through which our experience moves. It's one way of saying it. There's so many. We'll try a few. The antecedent self is this vast territory of consciousness itself in which I, the proximate self, arises, is another way of saying it. You might use the idea of the pure witness, spacious awareness itself. Maybe the term big mind works for you. The I, perhaps. But it is that field, that clearing, in which our self comes through. And this is the part that when Elliot and I were relating our stories, and I'm sure each of you, to your partners, even in the midst of such an intense experience of suffering, isn't there a part that can be at peace, can be just a kind of detached, yet totally present awareness? Detached in the best sense, in the sense of that's simply what is. So that's what we're talking about with the antecedent self.
I'll throw in just one point on that. And this is just, again, the benefit of having something like the antecedent self in your map as a therapist, in your map of what's possible for the human experience. But not all people identify with what we're talking about as an experience of the antecedent self. But for those who do, especially for those who come to us and they're suffering a great deal, even a glimpse of identification with the spacious field of awareness within which all things arise, and in which they're not suffering in the manner that they are when they walk into the office. If nothing else, it's just like a nice little break from suffering. For other people, it's kind of an Adriatic thread that they're following through their own development. Figure out, what is that? What is that? Now, if your map doesn't include it, I think we do a disservice to clients. You're probably all aware of the studies done on the MMPI-2 by Ralph Hood, who looked at mystical experiences, people who had what practicing communities of spiritual practitioners would say were legitimate mystical experiences. And when Ralph Hood gave these people the MMPI-2, many of them had very high psychoticism scores. And of course we get into a pre-trans fallacy. Well, the map for the MMPI-2 only goes to the healthiest aspects of the personal. So anything that's not personal is going to show up as pre-personal, which for somebody who is supposedly a well-functioning adult is looked at as pathology. And so again, by having this in our map, it can certainly be a great service to the clients.
Totally. So proximate, the sense of I, the sense of me at any moment, we do well to understand what that is for our clients to the best that we can, and we'll look at tools to help with that. Me then becomes mine when I have, in this sliding nature of the self, further developed, and we do well also to understand what a client embraces as mine, but not me, not all of me, not the immediate sense, but befriended as me. And also, with the antecedent self, just one other thought, is that it's that larger field of the antecedent self that embraces the therapeutic we, the miracle of we. So when we are attuned to some other vantage point of possible resource for what is going to occur in the session, I would say, all of our ILP practice hopefully gets us a little more in touch with this antecedent self as well, as practitioners.